Welcome to WhiskyCast, cask strength conversation featuring news and interviews from the world of whiskey. I'm Mark Gillespie. This is episode number 686 for March 25th, 2018. This week I'm in Cornwall, Ontario for the wonderful World of Whiskey show at the NAV Centre. Coming up in a few minutes.
What's great is these malts are at the start of their growth with the stock profile to go along with that. So to have, three malts just beginning to grow with inventory going back to the 1960s, wow, what an opportunity.
Over the last quarter of a century, Rachel Berry has helped create whiskies for some of Scotch whiskey's most storied brands. Last year, she stepped down as master blender at Beam Suntory's Morrison Bowmore Distillers Unit in Glasgow to take the reins from Billy Walker at Brown-Forman's Glendronach, Benriach, and Glenglassaugh distilleries, and she's putting her own stamp on those whiskeys now. She's known on Twitter as the Lady Blender, and we'll talk with Rachel Berry later on WhiskyCast in depth. I'll also have highlights from this weekend in Cornwall, along with the calendar of events, this week's Your Voice, and the What I'm Tasting This Week department, all coming up on this week's WhiskyCast.
This is Whisky, Johnny Walker's Scotch whisky, from this place and these people, aye, Scotch makers, creating the bold and complex flavour of Johnny Walker Black Label. Step right up.
WhiskyCast, brought to you by Redbreast, the definitive single pot still Irish whiskey. Those in the know Redbreast.
Let's get started with the week's news. It's brought to you by Highland Park. Whiskey lovers may have narrowly avoided being caught up in a trade war between the United States and the European Union. U.S. Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer told the Senate Finance Committee Thursday that the European Union will get a temporary exemption from new tariffs on imported steel and aluminum that took effect on Friday. The exemption will be in place until at least May 1st while the U.S. and EU negotiators work out a permanent solution. But there is a caveat. European Union leaders are not pleased with only getting a temporary exemption and are reserving the right to retaliate if talks fall through and the U.S. moves ahead with tariffs. As we've reported before, EU officials have threatened to impose their own punitive tariffs against bourbon and other American-made whiskeys if the Trump administration had imposed tariffs on European steel. That is, of course, more of a political target than a trade target, with the Europeans' emphasis on bourbon intended to send a message to Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell of Kentucky. But as of this weekend, it appears the trade war has been avoided for now. Meanwhile, there may be some progress on the Brexit talks between Great Britain and the other 27 members of the European Union. Leaders of those countries signed off Friday on a 21-month transition period to wind down Great Britain's membership in the EU, which is officially scheduled to take effect a year from now on March 29, 2019. The new deal means the UK will effectively remain in the European Union until the end of 2020. For Scotch Whisky Association CEO Karen Betts, that is still cutting things awfully close. The former British diplomat said this week that the transition should take as long as necessary to make sure there's no disruption to trade once the divorce is final. Friday's vote also opens the door to the start of talks on the future trade relationship between the two sides, but there has been no progress on what could be the biggest sticking point in the debate, the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. EU leaders want to avoid a return to a hard border between the two, and Irish Prime Minister Leo Varadkar hopes to have an agreement in place by June at the earliest. In other news this week, Kentucky state lawmakers are working on legislation that would allow the state's distillers to ship their whiskeys directly to consumers. Right now, it's technically illegal for a distiller to ship spirits to consumers outside of the Commonwealth. Now, a change in that law does not mean you'll be able to order directly from a distillery. but it will fix a problem that distillery visitors currently have. Right now, it's not legal for you to buy a bottle at a distillery's visitors center and have them ship it home for you instead of carrying it home in your suitcase. That's a request that has become commonplace at stops along the Kentucky Bourbon Trail and the state's other distilleries. And on that note, last month we reported that online whiskey retailers overseas are having problems in shipping orders to U.S. consumers. Both Master of Malt and the Whiskey Exchange reported that they are now limited in the number of U.S. states they can legally ship to through their U.S.-based customs brokers. After a lot of email exchanges, here's what we've been able to track the issue to. About a month ago, FedEx changed the way it handles alcoholic beverage shipments. Before, it worked on an opt-out system of complying with laws in each state. In other words, if a state specifically had rules against shipping whiskey and other distilled spirits to consumers, then it was on FedEx's no-ship list. Now, FedEx has switched to an opt-in basis, meaning that states have to specifically say it's okay to ship spirits to consumers, and that put all but a handful of U.S. states on the no-ship list. FedEx spokesmen have not given us an explanation for the policy change. Lots of new whiskeys to talk about this week. We'll start at the top end of the price list. But first, what were you doing the first week of January in 1956? Well, most of us were not even born yet. But that week Elvis Presley recorded his classic Heartbreak Hotel at Sun Records in Memphis. It's also the same week, on January 3rd, 1956 to be exact, that a cask was filled at Linkwood Distillery in Elgin, Scotland, just a mile or so away from the Gordon and MacPhail shop. That cask has now been bottled as Gordon and MacPhail's latest private collection bottling. It's the last cask of Linkwood from the 1950s in Gordon and MacPhail's inventory, according to the family's Stephen Rankin.
It was a time when the distillery would have been still furnished with its floor maltings. It would have had its copper top mash tun. It would have been the original Linkwood distillery with a single pair of stills. It had worm tub condensers. So everything would have been very much in a more older traditional way of making whiskey, giving the spirit a little bit more body and richness due to the distilling methods and of course the floor maltings as well. So the distillery manager at the time was Roderick Mackenzie, who was well known and good and friendly, very good friends of both George Urquhart and John Urquhart, obviously my great grandfather. And the whiskies were laid down just over a month before John Urquhart actually retired from the business, having worked in it since 1895. So he would have been 61 years in the business at that point. And so quite something. And we filled 7 casks. 3 of them were sherry butts and 4 of them were sherry hogsheads. And this is the last one to finally have been bottled.
Stephen says most of the 56 decanters have already been sold at a price of £22,000 each. That's around $31,100 at current exchange rates. Meanwhile, the Dalmore's Richard Patterson has been busy. He's created a new 45-year-old version of the Dalmore from whiskey's first matured in ex-bourbon casks, then filled into 2 vintage port pipes from the early 1960s for finishing. This one is not a one-time only bottling. White & Mackay plans to release 500 bottles a year over the next 3 years. No details on pricing, but as they say, if you have to ask, and that's the same deal with the latest Macallan limited edition. It's a 50-year-old single malt with just 200 bottles to be released worldwide this year. Brown-Forman gave us a hint this week of a special bourbon coming in June. Between the years immediately after Prohibition until 1968, Brown-Forman bottled the King of Kentucky bourbon brand, but discontinued it in 1968 as bourbon's popularity started to wane. That name is now being revived for a 14-year-old single barrel and barrel-proof bourbon that will be only available in Kentucky and a handful of other places on an annual basis. 960 bottles will be coming in June at a recommended retail price of around $200 each. More details as they are available. That's not the only new barrel-proof release from Brown-Forman this week, though. Master distiller Chris Morris has been quietly working on a cask-strength version of Woodford Reserve. It's coming out this month as Woodford Reserve Batch Proof, and as Chris told me this week, it'll be an annual release as part of the Masters Collection range.
What we call now the Innovative Masters Collection will be our annual fall release. Unique recipes, unique maturation profiles, barrel finishes that our great fans have been familiar with for so many years will continue to be released in November. But because of the overwhelming demand from consumers for a high-proof expression from Woodford Reserve, and obviously, as you will document how the industry is offering more of those types of releases, we've decided to add a second release every year, and that will be in the spring. And when I speak years, I'm thinking of our Woodford Reserve fiscal year, which ends with the Kentucky Derby, of course. So this will be an annual spring release as we anticipate going forward.
So what went into making this cask strength edition?
Well, that's the beauty of it. It's something we do every day with great success with our expertise of many, many years of making great bourbon. Every batch of Woodford Reserve starts out as a number of barrels batched together to create a consistent flavor profile. And when we empty the barrels, that collective proof, that combined proof of these many barrels will be what we call the batch proof. We take a calculation, we take a volumetric measurement, we take the temperature, and we calculate how much water, our limestone water, will be added to that batch to reduce it to our bottle strength, which is 90.4, and in bottle it goes. We're just skipping that intermediate step of adding water to this. We will take that batch proof at what it is presented to us, and we will bottle exactly like it is.
The 2018 Woodford Reserve Batch Proof is bottled at 62.9% ABV. It'll sell for around $130 a bottle. And by the way, Chris admitted during our interview that he has something else in the Woodford Reserve pipeline to be announced in May after the Kentucky Derby. He would not give up any details, though. Also out of bourbon country this week, Michter's is out with its latest release of 10-year-old single-barrel Michter's bourbon. It's a collaboration between maturation master Andrea Wilson and master distiller Pam Heilman. And as Pam told me on the phone this week, it's not really 10 years old. It's actually 12.
For us, the 10-year doesn't really mean anything. It means that what we have in the bottle has to be 10-year, obviously. But generally, it is more than that because we're doing it to a taste profile. We're waiting until we feel it meets the specific criteria, we're looking for, what we're looking for in our 10-year. That typical taste profile that people come to expect with our 10-year.
That's not unusual for this Michter's edition. The last batch of 10-year-old single barrel was around 11 years old in reality. It'll sell for around $120 a bottle. Elsewhere, the Glenlivet is playing Guess the Whiskey again this year. The Glenlivet Code is being released with no details on its maturation or any official tasting notes. Consumers will get to try and decipher the details using a special online app and a QR code on the bottle. It'll be available in 28 countries worldwide with a recommended retail price of around $120 a bottle. Loch Lomond has released a special single cask bottling of its 10-year-old Inchmurrin single malt at London's Heathrow Airport. It's exclusive to the World of Whiskey's shop in Terminal 5 at Heathrow and will sell for £59. That's around $84 a bottle. Weems Malts has added a new blended malt to its Scotch whiskey range. Nectar Grove is a Madeira cask-finished blend of Highland single malts. It'll be available in Europe and Asia for around £44. That's equal to $62 a bottle. And finally, Whiskey Magazine handed out its 2018 World Whiskies Awards the other night in London. Suntory's Hakushu 25-year-old was named the world's best single malt whiskey, while Sullivan's Cove from Australia won the Best Single Cask Single Malt award for its American Oak Single Cask release. Johnny Walker Gold Label Reserve won the World's Best Blended Whiskey award, while Sazerac's 1792 Full Proof was named the World's Best Bourbon. There are a bunch of other winners as well, and we've provided a list to the complete list for the World Whiskies Awards and the Icons of Whiskey Award winners in our show notes at WhiskyCast.com. One other note, Whiskey Magazine added King Carr Distillery's Y.T. Lee and T.T. Lee to its Hall of Fame, along with Diageo's Dr. Nick Morgan. Congratulations to all three. You can keep up with the latest whiskey news all week long at WhiskyCast.com. The news is brought to you by Highland Park, the Orkney Single Malt with Viking Soul. The days are getting longer around here, and that can only mean one thing. It's almost time for the light. Keep listening to WhiskyCast for more details on the next Highland Park Single Malt, or visit HighlandParkWhiskey.com.
Redbreast fans have always cherished our whiskey's sherry notes, so we set out to embellish that character. Introducing the Redbreast Listowel edition, a quintessential single pot still Irish whiskey finished in first fill Oloroso sherry casks from Spain's prestigious Bodegas Listowel. Carrying Redbreast's trademark pot still spices and dark dried fruit notes, the Listowel edition is graced with an enduring sherry finish that would be better described as a final act. Discover the newest branch on the Redbreast family tree.
Once again, I'm in Cornwall, Ontario this week for the Wonderful World of Whiskey show. Special thanks go to Ian Bentley and the entire staff of the NAV Center here in Cornwall for their hospitality this weekend. And by the way, look for the latest episode of the WhiskyCast Tasting Panel podcast this coming week. Our latest tasting panel gathered this weekend here in Cornwall for a blind tasting of 3 single malts. And you might not believe the results that Davin de Kergamo, Mark Bylock from the Whiskey Topic podcast, and Cornwall's own Frank McDonald came up with. You'll find the WhiskyCast Tasting Panel wherever you listen to podcasts, and of course at WhiskyCast.com. Let's open up the old inbox now for this week's Your Voice, brought to you by the folks at Lot 40. Had a lot of comments on last week's interview with Mark Rainier of Ireland's Waterford Distillery, especially about Waterford's experiment with biodynamically grown barley. Biodynamics, among other things, uses specially treated natural fertilizers to grow crops the way farmers did centuries ago, with things like cow horns filled with manure and buried in the field. As you might guess, that aroused a bit of skepticism. James Otter of Staffordshire, England, at Jotterface on Twitter, tweeted this: biodynamic whiskey, innovative use of natural barley fertilizer, or typical marketing nonsense, hashtag manure or bullshit. But Corey McRae is a bit more supportive. He tweeted this from Scotland: biodynamic farming is fascinating. A family friend is a biodynamic farmer, and his results are astonishing. The produce is healthy, strong, and nutrient-rich. Hard to understand how, but it seems to work. We also had this note from Instagram, from Matthew Ingram at Saratoga Matt on Instagram. I listened to this week's interview with Mark this morning as I got ready for work. I loved hearing his enthusiasm and commitment to making great whiskey. I hope I'm able to afford his whiskey when it reaches that 6 to 8 year mark discussed in the podcast. Now, our coverage of the potential trade war this week and its impact on American whiskey also generated some comments. From our Facebook page, Manuel Salazar posted this note: if a trade war does occur, I will do my part to support my country by drinking the excess whiskey, hashtag Patriot. Manuel, it looks like that may not be necessary right now, but thanks for being willing to step up and help. If you have something you'd like to share with whiskey lovers from around the world, you can always post it on the Your Voice page at WhiskyCast.com. You can also find us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Tumblr at WhiskyCast. And my email address is comments@WhiskyCast.com. This week's Your Voice is brought to you by Lot 40, Canada's award-winning 100% pot still rye whiskey. Lot 40, unapologetically Canadian. Please drink responsibly. Time now for the WhiskyCast calendar of events. The Nth Ultimate Whiskey Experience is coming up April 4th through the 7th in Las Vegas, Nevada. The Inverness Whiskey and Gin Festival is April 7th at Bogben Farm in Inverness, Scotland. The Whiskey Obsession Festival is April 11th through the 14th in Sarasota, Florida. And the International Wine and Spirits Fair is April 13th through the 15th in Antwerp, Belgium. I'll be at the American Whiskey Convention in Philadelphia on April 13th. Whiskey in Leiden is on the 14th in Leiden, the Netherlands. The Whiskey Fair is April 21st and 22nd in Limburg, Germany. And of course, the Spirit of Speyside Festival is May 3rd through the 7th in Scotland. Those are just a few of the more than 175 different whiskey events around the world on our searchable calendar at whiskycast.com. If you have a festival or a tasting coming up, just use the contact form on our website and let us know all about it.
This is Whisky. Johnny Walker's Scotch whisky. From this place, and these places in that place. These are the people that make it. This is what they sound like.
Because you're a cheeky wee blighter.
Dance like. Aye, like that. This is what they do all day. Building the great character of Johnny Walker Black Label. Aging in oak for 12 long years.
Thanks. Oh, it's gorgeous there.
What is character? It's giving a damn.
You're all right, lassie.
Which looks like this, as much as this. See, the land that shapes these people and the people that shape this whiskey all shape how bloody good it tastes.
Put the bloody game on the telly, Alan.
A whiskey as bold as it is complex. For every step you take, this is Johnny Walker Black Label, friends. Step right up.
Cut.
Can I drink this now?
Johnny Walker Black Label Blended Scotch Whiskey, 40% alcohol by volume, imported by Diageo North America, Norwalk, Connecticut. Please drink responsibly.
WhiskyCast In Depth is brought to you by Lagavulin. And once again, we're at the Wonderful World of Whiskey show in Cornwall, Ontario this week. One of the really fun things about WhiskyCast is the chance to see people and brands in their early days and watch them grow over time. WhiskyCast was less than a year old back in October of 2006 when we first met Barry Steen and Barry Bernstein in episode 63. Back then, they had just started Premium Bottlers. At the time, it was one of Canada's few independent bottlers of Scotch whiskies, and they'd both given up successful careers to move into the whiskey business. A few years after that, they opened up Stillwater's Distillery in the Toronto suburb of Vaughan, Ontario, and started making single malt whiskeys of their own. The other night, the Barrys, as they're known, won the World Whiskies Award for the Best Canadian Single Cask Single Malt Whiskey for their Stock and Barrel Single Malt Whiskey. Now, I've run into them a few times at whiskey events over the last several years, but it has been almost 5 years since I had the chance to talk with both Barrys at the same time. It's probably been, 10 years since we first talked at Spirit of Toronto, since you guys started doing independent bottlings, and now you're going back to blends, right? What's going on here? And tell me how things have progressed over the years.
Well, yes, we are going back to blends. So it's been an interesting chain of events, I guess is the best way to say that. The single malt and our 100% rye whiskeys are great, but they're a higher end product, and we need something that will draw people. And decided that we wanted to work on a Canadian whiskey blend since we're here. And we have the whiskeys, so we decided to do that, and they are selling and moving and getting great reception. And so that's why we've moved back to blends, is we needed something for consumers to sample us with.
And how did you create the blend between the rye and the single malt? What else did you have to do to make it happen?
So, like most Canadian blends, corn base, And our first instinct was, like most Canadian blends, use the rye for flavoring. We also had all this single malt, and we thought that would be an interesting addition. So we experimented for a couple of years, actually, before we came up with both of them. So in the end, we couldn't decide and released both the red blend and the blue blend. Exact same whiskeys in the blend, just different proportions. So both have corn base, rye, single malt. The blue, only a little bit of single malt. We've upped that significantly in the red, and we've ended up with two very, very different whiskeys. So, I mean, for me, the blending is a real challenge, much more difficult than distilling, and part of it is the art of blending and challenging ourselves to, like a good chef, take all these different ingredients and combine them and create something new and unique.
But it really goes back to what you guys had to do in the very beginning, when you were importing single casks from Scotland, and because of the Ontario laws, you had to blend it with locally produced Canadian whiskey, didn't you?
Yes, we did, and but at that point in time, we were adding the smallest amount of the Canadian whiskey that we could by law, so that it was mostly still the single malt from Scotland that we were wanting to focus on. So yeah, it was, but that's how we started. So a complete 360 almost from where we started.
Are you guys still having fun doing this, given that it's been 10 years now?
Of course. Yeah, no, fun. It is a lot of fun. Again, as Barry just mentioned a moment ago with the blending, that's really taken us to a whole new level. And an area that we didn't really focus on for many years. But it was a lot of fun to put these two blends together, and we have a third blend that we put out for Canada's 150th birthday in limited release. So that was an interesting project that we worked on. Again, same whiskeys, just different proportions, and playing around with the blend. So it's fun. It's good.
What have you guys learned over the last 10 years?
Not to start a distillery.
Yeah. I mean, for me, the real interesting thing was learning more about the business side of the whiskey business, especially in the last few years, as we've had more mature whiskeys and we're more out there in the marketplace. And my view is we're more whiskey sellers than whiskey makers, because we need to survive, and that's a whole other set of fun.
Would you do it all over again if you had to?
We get that question. I don't know.
Let me ask it this way. Would your wives let you do this all over again?
Absolutely not. No. It's been a labor of love, and it's been a struggle. We've talked about that in the past. It's been a struggle, but we're finally starting to see, some traction, and our products are well received, and they're selling, and we're expanding, and it's all coming together in a good way, we believe. So,
are you guys getting closer to seeing your sons want to come into the business?
My son actually is already, and almost from day one, he's been working in the distillery. Will it ultimately be a family business? I don't know. We'll have to see how that plays out.
I'll have tasting notes soon for their stock and barrel red and blue blends at WhiskyCast.com. Now, Friday night during the Wonderful World of Whiskey show, there was a fun little gab session at the pub here at the Nav Center. I'm standing here with Matt Jones, the Scotch whiskey ambassador for Beam Suntory in Canada, now after being a longtime bourbon guy. Matt, you told this story last night that I have got to hear about you trying to haul all these bartending tools through airport security around Canada and North America, and always getting hassled at some point or another, right?
I've got some pretty interesting tools in my kit. Some of them can be mistaken for other things depending how the X-ray picks them up. But one in particular I used to have was it was a bottle opener, but it was a butterfly knife. The handles looked like a gang weapon. So about once a month at a different airport in Canada, I would get secondary, and we'd have the whole laugh and conversation about what it actually is and what it isn't. They would give it back to me, and I'd be on my way. Well, one night in Edmonton, it didn't go exactly that way. I got flagged. I was surrounded by 4 RCMP officers. And they were pretty intense. They were pretty upset that I had this gang weapon, quote unquote, with me. By the time I explained what it is, they said, it's too bad, you're not supposed to have this. They confiscated it, and they began to kind of process me. They got my license, my name, and I'm like, oh, this is not going the way that I expected it. One of the officers, the biggest one out of the bunch, he looked down at my travel box, and he saw all the different labels and brands that were on the box I travel with, one of them being Canadian Club. He looked at that brand and said, Canadian Club? Well, you must know Dan Tulio and Tish Harkis. I said, do I? Of course, two of my mentors in the business. We sat down for 45 minutes, had a big old laugh, because he's a Windsor boy from Windsor, Ontario, where Hiram Walker is. And subsequently, since then, him and his wife have come out to every one of my events in Edmonton. So I've made some friends through whiskey, but it started off with kind of a precarious situation that could have gone a different way, for sure.
Did they give you the butterfly knife back?
They absolutely did not. And I've learned from that time. I don't travel with anything that can be mistaken for a gang weapon.
Thanks, Matt. Now, Rachel Berry has been part of the Scotch whiskey industry for the last 26 years. Last year, she left her job as the master blender for Beam Suntory's Morrison Bowmore unit in Scotland to join Brown-Forman as the master blender for its Benriach, Glendronach, and Glenglassaugh distilleries in Scotland. Over the years, she has worked on some of Scotch whiskey's most iconic brands. But I've never had a chance to sit down for a chat with her until she came to New York for a tasting the other night. First of all, let's ask the question that one of my listeners posed today on Twitter when I mentioned I was coming in to see you. Is the Glendronach 12-year-old original losing its age statement?
Absolutely not. The Glendronach 12-year-old is the flagship of Glendronach. It is the most perfectly balanced single malt at 12 years old, and it will continue and be here for a long, long time.
You've been releasing a bunch of new whiskeys lately. The Benriach cask strength batch number 2 that came out a few days ago, along with a bunch of the usual sort of quarterly batch of single casks and stuff. How hard has it been to try to go through the stocks and pick out these casks?
It's been a phenomenal opportunity, especially with Benriach. You know, it's Warehouse 13 is full of different casks. There's about 25 different cask types in that warehouse. You know, everything from port to Marsala to virgin oak to bourbon, you name it. You know, rum. We've got such an incredible diversity of casks, and because of that, what I wanted to do is to really bring to life for the drinker the experience of being in the lab and trying all these different casks. So that's what single casks are about, is giving the drinker the opportunity to try something different that they're never going to try again. So it's been an opportunity rather than a challenge.
And the Glendronach Grandeur, it's the latest release, the 24-year-old. Yeah. That's a new one that's out as well, too. And that was one you sort of played off of what Billy created originally, right?
Well, Grandeur for me, is the pinnacle of Glendronach. And over the years, there's been a few batches released. I did something a little bit different with this one. Batch 9, 24-year-old, hand-selected casks from a number of years. So this was a little bit different. So what I did was I picked the best from 1990, the best from 92 and 93, just a handful of casks, and layered in all the different flavors to create a grandeur that had finesse. It was powerfully complex, many different layers of taste, and very, very persistent. You know, that's what I was trying to achieve, the pinnacle of Glendronach. So yeah, it's been received very well so far here.
We haven't heard much about Glenglassaugh lately, sort of the third whiskey in that portfolio. When will we see some new stuff out of there?
Well, yeah, I mean, there's been just recently we have released some wood finishes globally. The Glenglassaugh has a very interesting stock profile. We've got some phenomenal older whiskies, and I think and I hope they'll be coming to the States quite soon. Maybe the 30-year-old and the 40-year-old expressions in particular, because they are absolutely superb single malts. We had a gap in the stock profile between 1986 and 2007, so you know it's going to take a little bit of time to get age statements with Glenglassaugh that are in the kind of 10 to 15-year-old age statement range. So yeah, I'm going to be having fun over the next year, looking at what the future of Glenglassaugh is going to be.
It's only been about a year or so since you joined the company and moved over from Morrison Bowmore. What did you know about the portfolio when you took the job? What did you know was in those warehouses? And what prompted you to make the move?
Yeah, I mean, all I knew really before I started was, what was out in the marketplace and what I'd heard about during my time in the industry. So I knew Ben Riach was one of the most experimental, innovative distillers in Scotland, with the most diverse and eclectic cask range. So I knew it was going to be like, a huge learning experience, even though I've been in the industry for 26 years and learned from tremendous malts. What's great is these malts are at the start of their growth, with the stock profile to go along with that. So to have, 3 malts just beginning to grow with inventory going back to the 1960s, wow, what an opportunity. Not many established brands can say that now that they have that opportunity. So yeah, it's everything from new make right up to 50-year-olds to bring to the world.
Has it been everything you hoped it would be in making the move over?
Absolutely. It's been a fantastic learning experience. I've been so lucky in my journey throughout my whiskey life. All the opportunities I've had today, and then in the past year it's been an incredibly steep learning curve for me, as you say, getting into the warehouses, sampling hundreds and thousands of casks of such diversity and intensity, and to be able to work with 3 distilleries that are in my home turf where I was born and brought up, that have the terroir of my my family going back in generations, and also at the same time being the pinnacle of style, from Glendronach, which to me is the pinnacle of single malt, in the very finest sherry casks, going back to the original style of malt, the most traditional style of malt you can imagine, really authentic malt. To have that opportunity is fantastic. And then also with Ben Riach, it is the most experimental malt, and to be able to take innovation to the next level is, great to have that opportunity at this stage in my career.
You mentioned 26 years in the business. We've never talked about this. How did you start in the whiskey business?
I started it as a research scientist. Dr. Jim Swan employed me. Sadly he passed away last year, but he brought me into the whiskey industry and was my mentor for 4 years. And during that time, very steep learning curve, learning everything about maturation, distillation you can imagine possible. Incredible amount of research then, which then led me into production in the subsequent 22 years thereafter, working with many different distilleries. So I've been very lucky, during my time in the industry. I've worked with across all the brands and companies I've worked with, almost 80 distilleries, I would say. It's been a phenomenal journey.
What was the best lesson Jim Swan ever taught you? He's been on the show a number of times before his untimely and very sad passing, and I've talked with a number of folks who've worked with him. What was the best lesson he ever taught you?
Oh, goodness me. I think he showed me how to combine, really serious science, the technical aspects of, in detail, being able to measure quality of maturation in warehouses and wood chemistry like no other, and combine that with the creative side of knowing what it means to the consumer, of knowing the sensory impact of all that analysis, and really just bring all that together to know what the right thing to do is for any malt whiskey, whether it be in the wood policy or in fine-tuning the cut points of the stills, and how it is really all synchronicity, how you can influence taste through so many different factors. It's never just one thing.
You made the switch after 4 years with Jim into production. How hard was it to make that switch from the science and lab side into the production side? And I'm assuming that was at Glenmorangie. If it wasn't, please correct me.
Yeah, no, that was at Glenmorangie, and it was a natural development because very fortunately I was able to apply all my science knowledge looking at in-depth projects into warehousing and wood maturation. So it was the application of what I'd learned at Scotch Whisky Research Institute with Dr. Jim Swan, and I continue to apply that to today, everything I learned on that journey, and it's really just building on that knowledge and understanding, and I learned something new every day. So yeah.
But how did you make the progression to blending? That's a unique skill, and it requires a really good nose. How did you make the transition, and when did you realize that you had the nose to be a blender?
I think I realised quite early on when I was at Scotch Whisky Research Institute. I always had an interest in whisky before I joined the industry. Passionate about malts. I come from a distilling country in Aberdeenshire. My dad was passionate about malt. So I think being a hobbyist and having a passion for it is a big part of it. The science is important. It's a tool. It's analytical. It helps your brain to work out the composition of the whisky and how it comes to be. But at the end of the day, you need to have a passion for it, and you need to be able to pick up aromas and tastes and really reflect the most sensitive proportion of the population. You need to be able to pick up when there's something wrong, or indeed when something is magnificent, and try and represent the super tasters in the world, effectively, that are out there, who undoubtedly are also the judges in all the spirit competitions too, who can make these judgments. So it's incredibly important. Having a good nose, taste, an appreciation of flavour is the most important thing in being a blender.
What can someone who is an amateur do to develop that nose? That's a question I get asked a lot. What can someone who's just learning about whiskey do to develop the nosing skills? Not necessarily to make their own blends, but just to appreciate the work that you're doing.
Nose as much whiskey as possible. You can never nose enough whiskey. That's all I can say. You just keep nosing casks, keep training your nose. You can do it obviously with scent, with perfume, in nature, just awaken, wake up and smell. Instead of smelling the roses, smell the whiskey, stop and smell, appreciate the moment, take the time to connect with your senses and discover. Yeah. There's no rights or wrongs. There's no one way. Everyone finds their own way.
You've made the transition over the years from being mentored in this business to being a mentor yourself. How hard was it to make that transition, and who do you see as the up-and-coming blenders of the future that you've been mentoring?
Yeah, this is a great question. Over the years, I've trained a lot of people in sensory training and really getting them to think about their senses and what they're discovering. And, that's a big part of passing on the learning. And I have a new recruit starting soon who will be working with me as an assistant. And, that's going to be a process of passing on the knowledge and passing on the understanding to ensure that the next generation will be the guardians of the finest spirit in the world.
Tough question. What's the biggest mistake you ever made as a blender?
The biggest mistake I ever made as a blender? Oh my goodness me. Gosh, that's a tough one. Oh.
We all make them.
Dearie me. I think not nosing enough whiskey is, I think when you select casks, you absolutely have to know exactly what's in every single cask. And I learned that very, very quickly when, especially with different batches of wine casks, they can vary quite a lot. So, I put a batch together, which was a little bit different from a previous batch, and realized very quickly that I needed to reevaluate the blending process and nose every cask and analyze every cask for color. I mean, with what we make today, what I make today with Glendronach and Benriach, these are natural color products as well. So a lot of it's about flavor, but it's also making sure that you get the right dynamic of color in the bottle from natural color too. So with wine casks, they can vary. And I made some portwood finish that was very red one batch, and the next batch was a lot more brown. And then I put in place, because of that, a new technology that measured the different wavelengths of the colour spectrum in the portwood finish, and therefore learned and had a new process for the future that ensured consistency.
Last question. What do you want your legacy to be 20, 30 years from now when you retire?
Oh my goodness. Just that, I contributed to the development of the finest spirit in the world, which is Scotch malt whiskey, that I had a part to play in making the best it could be, and also to bringing new consumers into malt whiskey as well, and I hope I've gone some way to do that, to bring people who might have not thought about trying single malt Scotch into whiskey through thinking about flavour, thinking about food, thinking about different ways of looking at single malt.
And thanks to Rachel Berry for spending some time with us on this week's WhiskyCast In Depth. Brought to you by Lagavulin. Look for the legendary Lagavulin 16-year-old Islay single malt at a whiskey shop near you, along with the Distiller's Edition and the new Lagavulin 8-year-old. Find out more at malts.com. The What I'm Tasting This Week department is brought to you by Heaven Hill Distillery. Let's start off with one of the Benriach single malts from Rachel Berry's tasting the other night. The Benriach 2005 limited release is a 12-year-old single cask bottling made with peated barley and matured in a portwood cask. It's an unusual combination, to say the least. It's bottled at 53.6% ABV, and the nose has a soft smokiness with dark fruit touches of plums and raisins, along with just a hint of Christmas cake. The taste is smoky, spicy, and tart with grilled pineapple, white pepper, allspice, and hints of honey and plums in the background. The finish is long with a subtle smokiness that lingers nicely with gently fading spices and dark fruits. I'm scoring the Benriach 2005 limited edition a 91. And as luck would have it, we have a similar whiskey to compare it to this week. Amrut's single cask number 4668 is bottled exclusively for the U.S. market, and it was also made with peated barley and matured in a port pipe, though for just 4.5 years instead of 12. The Amrut version is bottled at 56.5% ABV. The nose on the Amrut has notes of campfire smoke, plums, berry cobbler, and molasses, while the taste is intense and mouth-coating with a subtle smokiness that's balanced nicely by clove, chili powder, molasses, plums, and berry cobbler. The finish is long, subtle, and mouth-watering with just a kiss of smoke, molasses, and gentle spices. It's outstanding, and I'm scoring the Amrut single cask 4668 a 93. I'll have more tasting notes for you in just a minute, but first, this week's tasting notes are brought to you by Heaven Hill Distillery, proud to announce the release of a new series of Old Fitzgerald bottled in bond bourbons. Bottled in an ornate decanter inspired by a 1950s original, it carries on the legacy of John E. Fitzgerald and his act of larceny. Learn more at heavenhilldistillery.com/blog. Think wisely, drink wisely. I got to taste the new Ardbeg Grooves Committee Edition this week, and as I've reported before, it's matured in heavily charred casks that opened up grooves and cracks in the wood to let the whiskey really soak in. The Committee Edition is bottled at 51.6% ABV, and the nose has notes of black tea with honey and lemon, along with subtle peat smoke, a hint of heather, and brown sugar. The taste has that good Ardbeg smokiness that comes alive on the palate, with peat and a slightly medicinal touch, along with cinnamon and clove, dark chocolate, honey, vanilla, and heather. The finish is long and smoky with lasting spices, and I'm scoring the Ardbeg Grooves Committee Edition a 93. Now, here in Cornwall, Andrew Ferguson of the Kensington Wine Market in Calgary brought a special whiskey to his masterclass. Kilchoman Distillery is only 12 years old or so, and there are not that many 10-year-old bottlings available yet, let alone 10-year-old single cask Kilchomans. Andrew got his hands on one for the Kensington Wine Market, and it's an ex-bourbon barrel bottled at 56.6% ABV. The nose is bold but well-balanced with a great smokiness and gentle phenols that don't overpower the honey, black tea, heather, and malty notes underneath. The taste, well, it's just luscious. An Islay lover's dream with good peatiness balanced out by honey, barley sugar, a hint of black tea, soft fruits, and vanilla. And the finish, long and gentle, like a campfire fading away at the end of the night. I'm scoring the Kilchoman 2007 single cask bottled for the Kensington Wine Market a 94. Once again, the What I'm Tasting This Week department is brought to you by Heaven Hill Distillery, and I'll be adding these tasting notes to our searchable list of 2,100 different whiskeys from around the world at WhiskyCast.com. Of course, that's also where you'll find links for the WhiskyCast Tasting Panel podcast and our WhiskyCast HD videos, along with the latest whiskey news, events, and a whole lot more, including a complete archive of all of our past episodes. Now, if you like the show, and I figure if you've listened to this long, I'm guessing you probably do, I hope you'll take a minute this week and leave a review or a rating for us wherever you download your podcasts from. That helps other whiskey lovers discover the show when they're looking for new podcasts to listen to. We continue the cask strength conversation all week long online. You'll find WhiskyCast on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Tumblr. And I'd love to hear from you. You can reach me by email. The address is comments@whiskycast.com.
WhiskyCast. Brought to you by Redbreast, the definitive single pot still Irish whiskey. Those in the know Redbreast.
This is Whisky, Johnny Walker's Scotch whisky. From this place and these people, aye, Scotch makers, creating the bold and complex flavour of Johnny Walker Black Label. Step right up.
WhiskyCast is a production of Cask Strength Media, copyright 2018, and comes to you most weeks from the charming, yet regrettably dry town of Haddonfield, New Jersey. But this weekend I'm at the wonderful World of Whiskey show at the NAB Center in Cornwall, Ontario, Canada. I'm Mark Gillespie, reminding you that when you drink, please drink responsibly. Thanks for listening.